Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The first sound of morning in that small Bavarian cottage was always the scrape of leather against a cobbler's knife. The father would sit near the window, sharpening his blade, while the faintest steam rose from a pot of barley on the stove. Outside, the frost bit the wooden shutters. Inside, warmth battled scarcity. She learned the sound of work before she learned her letters. She was small then, with hands too eager and a nose dusted with ash from the stove. Her father let her cut patterns from scraps of old shoes. The mother quietly hummed a hymn while mending linen at the table. It was not singing for joy, but to keep the silence from hollowing out the room. The girl liked the pattern of those evenings, shine of lamp oil, cling of tin spoons, smell of glue and rye bread. They lived close to the earth, and the earth was stingy. When the church bell tolled, it was her cue to carry finished pairs of shoes to the neighbors. The way there led between fields where crows picked at frozen ground. She learned to read weather in their movements. 2 crows meant clear skies. 3 meant snow. 1 meant luck. She believed it, as every child in the village did. Luck seemed small enough to fit in crumbs, so she learned not to waste bread. Sometimes the father would grow stern while speaking of the taxman. His mouth thinned, voice breaking like old leather. The tax collector, he said, came not for the rich townsfolk, but for those whose walls smelled of stew and glue. The girl listened silently, tracing cracks in the table, knowing every syllable came from somewhere deep and unhealed. In winter, when debt notices arrived, both her parents would sit long after supper, counting coins until the candle leaned sideways in the wax. The collector came one gray afternoon, a man with neat boots and a polished smile that never touched his eyes. He inspected their small possessions, made notes in a ledger, and nodded as though approving a harvest. He left with the coins they had hidden under the bread pot. After he was gone, the room felt colder, though the fire had not gone out. Her mother muttered a blessing. Her father did not speak at all. That night, the girl dreamed of an endless road lined with barrels that swallowed sound. Work continued because it had to. Spring brought mud and sore fingers, but also small joys. She saved fragments of cloth from the mended shoes to make dolls with mismatched buttons. She gave them names she never told anyone. The neighbors paid in eggs or flour, and she learned early that favors often kept a house warmer than money. Once, returning from the well, she found a tiny robin trapped inside their shed. It flapped weakly against the glass, its wings speckled with dust. She set it free and watched it vanish into the pale afternoon. That moment lingered with her, the idea that something could survive a beating and still find the sky. Years later, she would think of that robin when hardship pressed close, though she would never say it aloud. Her father's hands grew slower as time passed. His cough deepened, and she began handling the customers. She liked listening to the gossip they brought, the mention of markets, of city taverns where people sang freely. Every story felt like a door left slightly ajar. When one traveler described Munich's arcades, the smell of beer and pepper, she felt something stir. A wish to see the places where work did not mean silence. Then came the harsh winter that took her father. The mother, dressed in black, laid out his tools and asked the neighbors to melt snow for washing. Death, in their world, did not stop the chores. Afterward, the cottage seemed too large for two women. They sold the workbench, the few remaining hides, and every pair of shoes waiting for payment that never came. Through that loss, she found a kind of strength shaped by absence. She learned to tend a fire, to trade carefully, to listen before speaking. When a merchant from Munich passed through, she helped mend the soles of his boots. Impressed by her brisk hands and steady temper, he offered her a place in his cousin's tavern, work in a warm room, tending to travelers and stew pots. The promise hung in the air like smoke, and she dared not hope too quickly. Before leaving, she walked once more through her father's shed. The smell of glue and ash still lingered. On the work table lay a scrap of unfinished leather, corner curled, stitch half done. She wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into her satchel, unsure whether it was for luck or remembrance. Her mother watched from the doorway, face hidden behind the shawl. No words were exchanged. The journey to Munich took most of a day. Mud splashed her skirts, her boots wore thin. The city appeared not as towers or palaces, but as roofs stacked over smoke, the air thick with malt and coal. Horses grunted along the cobbled road, and men shouted near barrels taller than she was. Somewhere she heard laughter, a sound that made her both curious and uneasy. By evening she found the tavern, its windows bright with lamplight. Inside, the air smelled of hops, roast meat, and humanity. Her heart beat with something close to fear and wonder. She had known small cottages and quiet fields. This was a different world, a place where voices clashed like tankards, and every coin seemed to sing louder than faith. When the tavern keeper asked if she could carry 2 jugs without spilling, she nodded. The man laughed softly, marking her resolve. He led her to the counter and handed her an apron that smelled faintly of beer and soap. The warmth of the room wrapped around her shoulders like something earned. That night, long after closing, she scrubbed the wooden floor until the foam turned gray. Outside, Munich shifted under a thin mist, lanterns flickering across puddles like coins on a table. She glanced at the darkened barrels lined by the wall, their hoops glinting in lamplight. Each one seemed to breathe quietly in its own rhythm, as though the tavern itself had a heartbeat. She rested her hands on one of them, the wood cold and damp beneath her fingers. Something about that stillness filled her with both comfort and unease. Perhaps she remembered that dream, the one of barrels on the endless road. But then she smiled faintly at her own foolishness. Life, she thought, was built on superstition and chance, and both were kinder than men with ledgers. She hung the apron to dry, poured herself a mug of water, and sat by the window as dawn began to pale the rooftops. The city's first carts rolled out, The baker's boy sang out the price of bread. She didn't yet know the full weight of dreams or misfortune waiting ahead. But she knew one thing, and that knowledge was enough to keep her steady. Work would always be her prayer, and silence her safest friend. The tavern never slept. It only changed its tone with the hours. In the daytime, merchants came for broth and ale, their laughter thick with coins. After dusk, soldiers and carters took their places, talking of wages, beasts, and women, while the lamps hissed with every gust that slipped through the shutters. She had grown into the rhythm without realizing it. The work was steady and rough, but she carried it as she carried the jugs, balanced, watchful, seldom complaining. Her arms toughened, her stride steadied, and the townsfolk grew used to her quiet competence. She was the one who served without spilling, who remembered who drank wheat or dark, who could calm a drunken quarrel with a raised eyebrow and a warm stew. The tavern keeper, a man with thinning hair and a laugh that always ended in a cough, grew fond of her diligence. He trusted her with the ledgers and, later, with the keys to the cellar. To her, each entry in the book felt almost sacred, a confession made in numbers and ink. Beer brewed, bread sold, candles burned down to their ends. A life could be measured that way, she thought, and perhaps judged more fairly than by prayer. Her bed was a narrow one in the attic above the kitchen. The slanted ceiling smelled of hops and soot, and in winter the frost crept in through the beams. Yet it was hers, a small island of privacy in a busy world. At night, when the tavern walls still glowed with the echo of voices, she would sit by the tiny window, mending collars or counting her savings. Coins clicked softly, like secret promises. She dreamed of one day renting her own small place, closer to the city gates where journeymen passed through. The city around her swelled with noise. Street musicians played waltzes near the marketplace. Artisans hammered at iron fences. Students argued about liberty and the price of beer. On Sundays, she sometimes walked to the riverbank, not for prayer, but to watch the laundry float like clouds on water. The sun there softened her thoughts. She liked to imagine that all hardship could be boiled, rinsed, and wrung out clean. One winter evening, an old brewer joined her table after the crowd had thinned. His hands smelled of yeast and oak. His talk was full of barrels and patience. He told her that every good ale carried a piece of its maker's mood. "Bitterness," he said, lifting his mug, "keeps it honest." She remembered that line long afterward, seeing in it a kind of truth that suited her life. The brewer visited often, bringing scraps of news and wry jokes about the city's new taxes on hops. She listened, laughed politely, and thought little of it, but his stories would return to her later in ways she could not then imagine. Money saved slowly, like rain filling a cistern. Each day she put aside a coin, sometimes two. When she crossed the market, she began noticing empty storefronts, counting their windows and picturing tables inside. The dream no longer felt childish. Hardship had trimmed it into something realistic. A tavern no grander than the one she worked in, only quieter, cleaner, shaped by her own temper. Years passed, marked by changing coinage and the fading of old songs. The tavern keeper aged quickly, and when sickness took his breath for the last time, his widow sold the place. Some workers left Munich altogether. She did not. She had learned to hold her ground with the same patience the barrels held their brew. Luck, as her father used to say, visits those still standing when the storm moves on. So she took a modest loan, signed her name with a steady hand, and opened a tavern of her own on the street behind the marketplace. The floorboards creaked, the benches were mismatched, and the first barrels leaked more than they poured. But her soup drew customers. Her prices were fair, and her quiet humor made even the city clerks feel at ease. She printed no signboard at first. Word of mouth was enough. The tavern became a resting place for all ranks of fatigue. Carters leaving the city drank beside apprentices on their day's wage. She knew how to listen without judgment, when to feign ignorance and when to hide a smile. She trusted easily those who sat by her hearth too often, and that softness sometimes cost her. A missing coin purse, an unpaid tab, a promise forgotten in laughter. None of it hardened her. She simply took more care the next time, and told herself kindness was cheaper than quarrel. Around her, Munich grew restless. Factories rose near the river, trains shrieked beyond the hills, and strangers arrived searching for work. Officials tightened taxes on drink and trade. Inspectors prowled the markets in stiff coats. She learned to bow slightly when they entered, to pour them clean ale and answer no unnecessary questions. Her tongue could turn polite faster than fear could show itself. People called it caution. To her, it was survival shaped by memory. Sometimes, late after closing, she would wipe down the tables and think of her parents' cottage. The smell of leather still lived somewhere in her mind, faint but steady. She wondered what her father would think of this life built from foam and figures. Would he see prudence or compromise? Perhaps both. Her few friends were practical souls, a widow who sold candles, a cartwright who once promised to repair her broken door and finally did 2 years later, and the brewer who had taught her that bitterness lends honesty. He still brought her kegs now and then, his beard grayer, his jokes flatter. Life aged him as it did the oak of his barrels. Still, there was comfort in familiar trade. She had developed a quiet pride in her independence. Though the evenings were long and the noise endless, she sensed her worth in small gestures. A nod from a regular customer, a word of thanks from a stranger, a night of profit enough to pay the rent and save more than a coin or two. Her tavern smelled of wood smoke and onion stew, and when the lamps flickered out, she felt accompanied by the faint hum of contentment left behind by others. Occasionally, she would notice the constables passing by on their rounds, faces hidden beneath caps, boots dark with street water. She greeted them respectfully, as was proper. One of them, a quiet, narrow-faced man, seemed to pause longer than necessary by her doorway, though perhaps it was only the lamplight playing tricks. She paid it no mind. Trust was a luxury she reserved for those who could earn it with years rather than glances. As seasons turned, her small business found its rhythm. Rains came, roofs leaked, debts rose and fell like tides. Yet each morning she would be the first to draw water from the pump, to light the stove, to smell the warmth of yeast rising before dawn. In those moments, before the first customers arrived, the tavern belonged entirely to her. On slow afternoons, she often watched through the window as the market square stirred under patches of sun and cloud. Children chased stray dogs, women bargained over apples. A tax clerk stood near the weighing post, his uniform clean and smug. She distrusted men like that, too smooth in speech, too certain that the world was theirs to measure. Yet she greeted him with the same polite composure she offered everyone. Her humor softened what anger she felt, the way foam calms the bitterness of ale. One evening, After the last guest had left, she leaned against the counter and listened to the rain tick against the shutters. The tavern smelled of wet ash and bread. Her hands were sore, her back weary, yet she sensed something close to peace. Life was not kind, but it was dependable. Work filled the hours, laughter visited often enough to keep loneliness modest, and hope, though quiet, kept its corner by the fire. Upstairs, her attic bed awaited with a thin quilt and a coin box beneath the floorboard. Tomorrow would bring another delivery from the cellar, another visit from the brewer, another round of toasts and quarrels and songs half forgotten. For now, only the rain spoke, its simple rhythm echoing her thoughts, steady, forgiving, unending. And so passed the years of foam and ash, the long apprenticeship of self-reliance. The city grew louder, her laughter quieter, but both endured. If sorrow ever reached her, it found her busy with work, apron tied, sleeves rolled, too occupied with life to surrender to regret. Munich outside might twist and change, yet within those warm wooden walls she remained constant, like the low flame that outlasts the wind. There are mornings when the air seems to hold its breath, as if afraid of what the day might bring. That was one of those mornings. Fog swelled in the alleys near the marketplace, wrapping the rooftops in pale wool. Dew clung to wagon wheels, and the cobbles glistened like the inside of a shell. She had risen before dawn, as usual. In silence, she prepared the fire, drew a bucket from the pump, and checked the cellar where the new barrels had arrived the night before. They were arranged neatly, the hoops shining faintly through the gloom. The scent of fresh oak still clung to them, stronger than the older barrels where beer had already fermented and settled to rest. When she tapped the first barrel for inspection, the sound that came was wrong. It rang dull, uneven. She frowned, thinking perhaps the wood had swollen, or the cooper had left moisture trapped inside. She fetched her mallet and candle, bent close, and noticed a thin seep of liquid near one seam. Not beer, it was something darker, thicker, with the faintest trace of iron. The candlelight trembled. For a moment she thought she had misseen it, but as she pried open the lid, the air shifted, the way air does before a storm. And then came the truth, silent and terrible. Floating in the pale brine of spilled ale was a man's face, swollen and slack, the color of sour milk. His coat was torn, and the insignia on his sleeve, though smeared, still showed the mark of the tax office. The eyes were half open, as if still collecting debts. She staggered back, her breath caught between disbelief and nausea. The candle fell, sputtering on the wet stone. The smell struck her then, yeast and decay mingled into a stench that spoke of too much humanity in too small a space. She straightened, pressed her palm to her mouth, and for a long while did not move. The noise of footsteps reached her from above. Someone had heard her drop the mallet. It was the baker's boy, come to deliver bread for the midday stew. She stopped him at the door with a half-whispered warning, sent him swiftly toward the constable's post, then sat down at the foot of the cellar stairs, her back against the wall. She did not cry. She simply waited, her hands clasped, as if in silent prayer. When the constable arrived, the fog outside had thickened. He was the same narrow-faced man who had lingered at her doorway once or twice, now more tired than stern. With him came two assistants, both reluctant to step too close to the barrel. The cellar filled with the murmur of orders and cautious movements. The constable examined the body, muttering to himself. Then his gaze found hers. "You did not move it?" he asked. She shook her head. "No." "I opened it. Nothing more." He studied her face, perhaps searching for deceit, and then turned back to his task. The assistants lifted the body onto a cloth. A metal badge fell from the dead man's pocket, clinking faintly against the floor. One of the helpers picked it up, muttering that this was indeed the missing tax collector, the same one who had not reported back after his last round of collections. By midday, the entire street buzzed with news of the discovery. Customers avoided her door. Neighbors peered through cracks in their shutters. Questions multiplied faster than answers. How did the body end up in her barrel? Who had delivered it? And what would the magistrate decide once the inquiry began? That evening, when the constable returned to take her statement, the tavern was still and shuttered. Candles flickered unevenly in their holders. Her soup remained untouched on the stove. She spoke plainly, truth measured in calm syllables. The barrels had arrived from the brewer's warehouse, marked as usual, though the driver delivering them had been new to her. She remembered the wheels squeaking, the man humming a song she couldn't place, but nothing more. The constable took notes and asked again, his tone polite but heavy. She answered once more, identical to before. After he left, she stood alone among the chairs, each one facing a direction that now felt disordered. The tavern smelled faintly of soap and dread. She thought of closing it forever, but remembered the loan not yet paid, the sacks of grain, the small pile of coins saved for the next season's delivery. Fear and practicality rarely argue. One simply bends the other. She cleaned until midnight, though the scent of death clung to the walls no matter how much she scrubbed. In the following days, gossip spread like spilled ale across cobblestones. Some said she had quarreled with the taxman over unpaid dues. Others whispered that she had loved him once and now regretted it. Both tales were far from truth, but truth rarely travels as quickly as rumor. A few loyal customers still visited, offering awkward comfort with cautious glances. Each word of sympathy carried a question behind it. The brewer, when summoned by the constable, swore he had sent clean barrels. His face was red, his hands trembling. She watched him carefully when he next entered her tavern, noted the beads of sweat on his brow and the faint smell of spirits masking something sourer. He seemed nervous in her presence, though he tried to appear at ease. She remembered his old saying, "Bitterness keeps it honest," and wondered now if guilt had its own flavor. Business dwindled. Even the evening drinkers carried unease, glancing at the door each time it opened. The constable came often, asking more questions, each time gentler than before. Perhaps he pitied her. Or perhaps he wanted the story clear enough to defend himself when the magistrate pressed for results. She answered patiently, as though pain could be managed through repetition. One afternoon, while rearranging the jars behind the counter, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror hung by the door. The face that looked back was one she barely recognized. Older, sharper, as if carved from wax. A trace of humor remained around her mouth, faint but defiant. She straightened her shoulders and went back to work. No scandal, no corpse, no whisper could take from her the one thing she had earned honestly: endurance. Still, the nights grew difficult. Every sound from the cellar seemed to breathe accusation. When rain pattered through the roof tiles, she imagined the faint drip was a whisper repeating what she could not forget. the sight of that pale face floating under candlelight. Sometimes, sleep visited in brief spells, broken by the thump of barrels settling or the cry of drunkards outside. She learned to live with the unease, the way one lives with a scar that has long stopped bleeding, but never stops remembering. Then came a note, slipped under her door early one morning. Unsealed, written in a hurried hand. You trusted the wrong man. No name, no other words. She read it twice, then burned it in the stove, watching the smoke twist upward like the ghost of confession. After that, she began to pay closer attention, listening to how the brewer's men spoke when they thought she was out of earshot, watching who lingered near her cellar door after dark. Her humor faded, replaced by quiet observation. She learned that fear can sharpen the mind as surely as hunger can sharpen a knife. Weeks later, the constable informed her that the investigation remained open but directionless. The magistrate wanted evidence, not stories. The dead man's possessions had revealed no clues beyond a small list of names, villagers, tradesmen, debts, and her tavern's address among them, noted only as future collection. She realized then that justice in their world depended more on convenience than truth. Still, life pressed on. Bread had to be baked, barrels rolled, mouths fed. When the market bell struck, she threw open her shutters and pretended not to notice the small crowd watching from across the square. The smell of stew drifted into the air once more. A few regulars returned, drawn by hunger stronger than fear. The tavern began to breathe again, though differently, as if with one lung instead of two. In the evenings, she sometimes would stand by the window after the last guest had gone, looking out toward the fog that rolled along the stones. The city seemed endless from there, each lantern a separate universe of secrets. She wondered who had written that note, and whether the truth would ever rise, swollen and undeniable, like that face from the barrel. For now, it stayed beneath the surface, buried under trade and habit and the quiet demands of survival. Yet something within her had changed, as if she had stepped behind her own shadow and found it heavier than expected. She no longer trusted easily, not even herself. But she worked, as ever, hand steady, gaze level, humor dimmed, yet unextinguished, because to live was to endure, and to endure was its own quiet kind of courage. The first days after the constable's last visit passed slowly, in that uncertain silence that follows public scandal. Customers came in cautious drifts, their voices low and guarded. A few regulars kept their places out of loyalty or habit. Others preferred to drink elsewhere, where the air was not thickened by rumor. She learned to accept the emptiness between the tables, polishing cups already clean just to keep her hands from stillness. From the street, the tavern looked unchanged. The lantern beside the door burned steadily. The casks sat side by side, and the skillet still hissed each morning when she fried onions for the stew. Yet something unseen had shifted. The laughter that once filled the room seemed thinner now. Even the wood of the tables held its tone differently, as though they too had overheard the whispers. Each time she fetched ale from the cellar, she moved more carefully. The faint hum of dripping moisture in the stone walls, once a comfort, now carried a pulse of unease. A broom leaned against the spot where the accursed barrel had stood, a poor talisman against memory. She no longer dreamed of the corpse itself, but of the sound the wood had made when she first broke the lid, that hollow, traitorous thud that turned daily labor into a mark of dread. The constable returned often. He came without ceremony, stepping in like an old acquaintance, his boots wet, his coat smelling faintly of candle grease and rain. He ordered a single mug, though he scarcely drank it. He asked about the brewer, the deliveries, the faces of the men who brought them. His tone was never harsh, but his eyes betrayed the fatigue of someone expected to build truth from fragments. She answered honestly, as always. Their conversations were brief, half-words and scribbled notes, like pieces of a story neither quite believed. Outside, spring stirred uncertainly. Market stalls reopened, wagons groaned with fresh goods, and the square filled once more with shouts. Yet talk of the taxman's death lingered like a stubborn fog. Some villagers swore the tavern was cursed. Others suggested she had enemies among the tax office clerks, though none could name a motive beyond envy or vengeance from some unpaid levies. She began recognizing subtle shifts in how people greeted her. A hesitation before politeness, a step back before a nod. The widow from the candle shop came frequently, bringing news under the guise of neighborly concern. She insisted on speaking near the hearth, lowering her voice. "They say the brewer's warehouse had barrels missing the next morning," she whispered once. "2 gone, perhaps 3. Best not to repeat it." Then she smiled thinly, the kind of smile that thrives on secrets, and changed the subject to weather. That same evening the brewer himself came by, asking for workman's stew. His face had lost its color. His manner was overly cautious. He claimed to have doubled his checks on inventory since the incident and thanked her for not tarnishing his name before the constable. She nodded as she ladled stew into his bowl, but inside something sharp twisted in her chest. Gratitude, so deliberately spoken, often hides fear. When he left, she wiped the counter and found her hands trembling. That night, she reread her account book, line by line, checking each delivery and payment. Nothing unusual appeared, yet unease gathered in her stomach, as if the ink itself hid deceit. Weeks turned into months. No verdict came, only fragments of rumor, each contradicting the next. The magistrate had grown impatient. The constable confessed one evening, when the tavern was empty, that he might soon be reassigned if no progress was made. She served him a fresh mug and said quietly, "Truth doesn't knock on doors when it's wanted. It slips in when no one watches." He managed a weary half-smile. Their quiet understanding grew into a kind of friendship. They spoke rarely but with candor, their words like small coins exchanged in trust. She noticed he treated her differently than others did. Less as a suspect, more as someone who shared his fatigue with the world's confusion. One evening, when he paid his tab, he left a single copper piece extra on the counter. "For your trouble," he said. But she sensed what he meant was something else entirely. For patience, for endurance, maybe for simply staying. Despite the shadow hanging over her name, work continued. On festival days, her tavern filled again. Farmers, musicians, traveling students from Munich's nearby academy. The smell of pitch and roasted sausages replaced fear for a few hours. Yet joy never lingered long. Whenever the keg was tapped too swiftly or a crate creaked unexpectedly, the guests fell silent for a heartbeat, reminded of what had once been found beneath her floor. At night, the widow would linger later than necessary, feigning interest in the bookkeeping while probing with gentle questions. "They say the constable favors you," she remarked once, pretending humor. "Be careful. Affection from authority never lasts. The tavern keeper met her gaze evenly, saying only that kindness was her trade, same as beer. The widow laughed, a fluttering sound with no warmth in it, and departed, her candle wobbling in the wind. Summer brought heat and a brief relief from the heaviness inside the cellar. She took to sleeping with the window open, letting the sound of the marketplace drift through the night, a rhythm of carts, barking dogs, and the faint glimmer of accordion songs. There were moments when she almost forgot the shape of the taxman's face, yet even peace grew wary within her, as if waiting for another intrusion. One afternoon, a traveling clerk stalked by, a thin man with a courteous manner and ink-stained fingers. He ordered a small meal, then lingered after finishing. He mentioned he'd been reviewing ledgers from the tax office archives. Without prompting, he observed that the murdered collector's own records contained inconsistencies, amounts gathered higher than those reported, lists of payments erased and rewritten. She listened, never interrupting. When he spoke of falsified debts and quiet extortion, her stomach turned cold. "Would the constable know of this?" she asked when he paused. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps not. People in offices prefer not to notice where guilt might climb too high." Then he lifted his hat and left as quietly as he had come. That night she sat long after closing, staring at the flickering lamp near the counter. If the tax collector had cheated his books, then his death might have been seeded in revenge or in fear of exposure. And if so, every name in his records was now a possible suspect, including perhaps those who had supplied him with the ale he drank before his last evening alive. Her thoughts tightened like wire. The brewer's nervousness, the widow's knowledge of missing barrels, the stranger's warning note, each piece now slid together in a pattern she had been too weary to see before. Still, suspicion was a dangerous indulgence, especially for a woman alone. Truth might exist, but to reach it was to risk being crushed under it. The next morning, she began keeping a small notebook under the counter, recording odd remarks, delayed payments, glances that lingered too long. She made no judgment yet, only collected fragments. Her life had become a listening post. Autumn came quietly, with fog thicker than the one from months before. The square filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts and damp wool. The constable visited less often. He had other cases now, smaller but less troublesome. When he did come, he looked distracted, his coat unbuttoned, his shoes unpolished. He still spoke gently with her, though his words carried less certainty, as if even he had begun doubting the usefulness of duty. One late evening, after he departed, she noticed the widow peering through the window from across the street. Their eyes met. The older woman did not look away. It was not curiosity in her stare, but a kind of warning, cold and sharp as glass. The tavern keeper shivered, though the air was not cold. She drew the curtains and locked the door. That night she dreamed of barrels again, not the rotting horror this time, but rows and rows stretching into darkness, all of them whispering softly in a language without words. She walked among them, hearing her own footsteps echo like spilled coins. Somewhere in that dream, she understood what fear truly meant. Not panic, but quiet knowledge. That something vital had already begun to change, and there was no returning to the peaceful ignorance of before. When dawn broke over the market, she opened the shutters to let in the pale light. The air smelled of rain and malt. She filled the stove, trimmed the lamps, and prepared for another day. Work remained her best disguise, patience her only weapon. Around her, The city went on breathing its uneven breath, and she matched it, calm on the surface, wary underneath, waiting without admitting to herself that she was already part of a mystery far from finished. The storm that came after harvest was long and mean, scattering branches across the streets, tearing awnings from the market stalls. Rain washed away dust and gossip alike, though neither stayed gone for long. People returned to murmuring about the tavern keeper, their voices half curious, half forgiving, as if the tragedy in her cellar had already begun to knead itself into rumor rather than crime. Life, they said, moves on, though some eyes kept glancing sideways at her door. Inside, she kept her rhythm: light the stove, ladle the soup, serve the ale, balance the accounts. Habit was her discipline and her mercy. Yet something inward had altered. The old trust in everyday order had soured, and she looked at each barrel as if it might hold another secret. Work went on, but peace no longer followed it. The brewer's deliveries resumed after months of hesitation. His handwriting on the invoices had grown shaky, his remarks clipped. He aged quickly that year. His once rosy cheeks turned the color of clay. Each visit he avoided her eyes, yet spoke too much, insisting his trade was honest, his men reliable, his barrels sound. One evening he lingered after closing and told her unasked that people were blaming the widow for the tax collector's death, claiming the man had pressed her for fees she could not pay. "They'll always look for someone weaker," he said, rubbing his chin. "Best to stay quiet when rumors bloom." That word, quiet, stayed with her long after he left. Sometimes quiet could protect, but sometimes it could conceal. Autumn deepened. Smoke from nearby chimneys tinted the streets sepia, and leaves drifted into the gutters like burnt paper. On one such evening, a letter arrived from her mother's distant cousin in the countryside, informing her that the old cobbler's cottage had finally been sold. There was little left of the past now, only the scrap of leather she kept folded in her chest by the bed. The memory of that home felt like something carved in frost, delicate, nearly gone with the first touch of warmth. A restlessness began to grow. The tavern had become both her fortress and her cell. She served men who looked just enough like the dead tax collector to make her avert her gaze. Customers told coarse jokes. The coins clattered, and she responded as always, working, laughing lightly, never giving away the storm inside. One night, unable to sleep, she decided to travel back to her old village. Just a few days, she told herself, to breathe where life had once been simple. The road wound between bare trees, wet with mist. The journey took most of the day, by wagon and then on foot. The village had changed little. Still the same church tower, leaning slightly to one side. The same well where she had fetched water as a girl. But poverty had deepened. Paint peeled from shutters, and the cobbler's workshop now stood abandoned, windowless. The scent of tanned leather was gone. She spent the evening at the inn, listening. Memories rose unbidden. Her father's hands, the sound of rain leaking through the roof, the collector's boot scraping the threshold years ago. Now she asked, quietly, about the brewer's younger days. The innkeeper's wife, weary but talkative, recalled that he'd once been accused of selling watered ale and dodging his license fees. The tax collector had spared him, she said, after receiving certain favors, grain, and perhaps more than grain. The details blurred with time, but truth does not dissolve. It sinks like stone into a well, steady and cold. This knowledge followed her back to Munich like a shadow. When she reached the city, the tavern smelled strange. Someone had spilled ale near the hearth days before, and the floorboards were sticky. The widow was waiting for her, pretending surprise at her return. "You've been missed," she murmured, though her eyes betrayed calculation. That evening, as flames in the stove hissed over wet wood, an uneasy smell rose again, not smoke, but something acrid, like burnt grain. She lifted the kettle, expecting to find it scorched, but instead saw a twisted scrap of paper lodged near the base. When she pulled it free, she recognized at once the brewer's handwriting. It was a note, partially burned, the corners blackened, but the words still legible. "We cannot keep the barrels here. Too great a risk. Make sure she suspects nothing." For a long moment she stood motionless, the kettle in one hand, the note trembling in the other. The room around her narrowed, sounds turning distant. Then she placed the paper carefully atop the counter, smoothed its edges, and read it thrice more until each letter seared itself into her thoughts. She said nothing to anyone that night, not even to the constable when he came later to warm himself by the fire. Instead, she served his ale as usual, asking about the harvest in the nearby towns, nodding at his tired stories. Inside her mind, though, the note kept whispering. The brewer's name, the widow's cunning smile, the fear that their mistake could again fall upon her shoulders. All of it circled through her thoughts like crows above a field. When the constable left, she locked the door and sat alone, staring at the boiling kettle. Steam rose in pale ribbons. The note's ashes lay beside her, edges curling closer to nothingness. She felt neither anger nor despair, only a deep, methodical clarity. The following morning she went to the brewer's warehouse. Workers clustered amid the barrels, rolling them onto carts. The brewer greeted her with forced cheer. "Early for business," he said. "We're delivering for the military garrison this week." She smiled, measured the room, then asked quietly, "Do you keep records of which barrels go where?" His answer came too fast. "Of course, all by number and weight." She pretended satisfaction and left without another word. That evening she examined her old invoices again. 2 of the barrel markings from the fatal shipment were missing in every record, not erased, not misnumbered, simply skipped, as if they had never existed. Work helped her think. Each task, serving, scrubbing, tallying coins, settled her impatience. But tension grew around her too, as if the walls had begun to feel what she now knew. The widow grew more watchful. The constable visited rarely, overworked and short-tempered. He asked about her travel to the village, and she mentioned nothing of what she'd learned, saying only that the country air had felt good. He left quickly, as though relieved she had stopped asking questions. Days shortened, the nights turned long and damp. One evening a weary man entered the tavern, a city clerk again, though not the same as before. He seemed cautious at first, then leaned closer when the room grew loud. "Keep your door barred at night," he murmured. "There's talk that the taxman's death is being reopened. Someone's pressed the magistrate with new evidence, but not in your favor." His hand trembled as he lifted the cup. "Stay careful. Not all hands write what they mean." Then he paid and left, disappearing into the fog. That night, unease pressed on her like a weight. She left the lamps burning and sat awake beside the stove. From the street came distant noises, a cart rolling too slowly, a door slamming. When she checked the latch at dawn, she found footprint marks near the back wall of the tavern, where the cellar windows lay. too large for a child, too deliberate for drunks. By now, fear had become familiar enough to study. It sharpened her senses rather than dulling them. She began keeping a poker near the counter, though she told no one. When customers laughed and toasts rang out, she smiled and answered as always. Inside, she mapped their faces, memorizing who looked where, who drank what, who stayed too long. One rainy evening, the widow arrived again, claiming to seek shelter from the storm. She sat by the fire, hands outstretched, and spoke softly about the brewer's illness. "He isn't well," she said. "Cough and blood, they say. People whisper he might be leaving the city soon." The tavern keeper poured her a cup of boiled wine and watched her reflection darken in the liquid. "Strange," she said lightly. "For a man with nothing to hide, he seems in a hurry to disappear." The widow did not answer. Only the sound of the rain filled the space between them. When the woman finally left, a feeling like closure, or perhaps warning, settled in the air. Later that night, the tavern keeper took the last of the ashes from the burnt note and buried them behind the building, under a thin layer of damp earth. The act felt neither symbolic nor final, just necessary. She could not yet show what she knew, not until truth had shape enough to protect itself. For now she would keep watching, keep listening, keep serving. Morning came cold and silent. Steam rose from the kettle once more, pure and clean this time, smelling only of barley and water. Outside, the city began to stir with its routine noise, hooves, vendors, bells. Inside her small tavern, she prepared for another day with measured calm, aware of how close danger still stood. But she also felt something else return at last. A spark of resolve, small but persistent, like a coal buried deep in ashes, waiting for breath. Winter came early that year, sliding into the city on a wind that tasted of coal and frost. Snow covered the roofs unevenly, as though the sky had lost patience in trying to be gentle. Cartwheels groaned along the narrow streets, leaving streaks of brown slush in their wake. Everything smelled faintly of iron and smoke. The tavern remained open, though fewer travelers stopped by. She kept the fires strong and the lamps clean, more out of duty than optimism. Coins grew scarce after the feast days. People drank fast, but tipped little. Even so, she liked the company, men thawing their hands over bowls of soup, women sharing gossip about neighbors, all unaware that their half-spoken words stitched the fabric of truth more tightly around her. Since burning the brewer's note, her world had sharpened into two planes, the visible calm of daily life and the secret geometry of suspicion beneath it. She had grown skilled at moving between them. Her customers saw only a steady, pragmatic woman, one who filled mugs and offered a dry joke about the weather. They did not see how she listened, not only to what people said, but to what they did not. The constable returned less often, burdened by other duties. When he came, his manner was subdued, almost fond. He still asked questions about the case, though his pen moved slower now, the ink drying in clotted lines. The magistrates had lost interest. Too many new matters occupied their ledgers, disputes over rent, over smuggling, over grain shortages. Death, like misfortune, had become just another line of ink. One evening, as snow began to fall thickly, the widow entered again, her cloak dusted white. She ordered warm ale and said little. Yet the way she watched the room betrayed thought. When their eyes met, the tavern keeper noticed a flicker, not fear precisely, but a deep weariness, as if the older woman had lost the will to keep up appearances. Halfway through the cup, the widow leaned closer and murmured, "You should know. The brewer's gone to his brother's estate near Augsburg. They say his lungs have turned to stone from the dust." The words carried both relief and unease. Illness was a convenient reprieve, but it also placed him safely beyond reach. The tavern keeper folded her arms, studying the steam on her cup. "May he find peace," she said simply. Yet she knew that was unlikely. That night she sat late by the stove, ledger open before her. Her eyes followed the numbers again. Barrels bought, ale sold, months crawling by in loops of debt and subsistence. 2 missing records still stared back at her, stubborn as unburied bones. The next morning the constable arrived without his usual hesitation. His boots tracked snow across the wood. He looked older, his coat unbuttoned, his expression resigned. "There's news," he said. "The brewer collapsed on the road to Augsburg, died before he reached the gate." She listened quietly. He studied her face for reaction. None came. "Strange how death prefers busy men," he added softly, half to himself. Then, lowering his voice, "The same morning he left, a messenger brought new evidence to the magistrate. Anonymous again, ledgers from his warehouse showing barrels unaccounted for. He might have been trying to flee before the arrest." "Do they suspect more?" she asked. The constable exhaled. "They think others were involved, yes. The widow, perhaps, some workers, maybe you still." The kettle whistled faintly on the stove, a reminder of unfinished things. She poured 2 mugs of water and handed one to him. "You must be tired," she said. "They make you chase the truth, but never feed you while you do." He smiled, though weakly. "If truth were simple, we'd drink it like beer." He left soon after. She stood long by the window, watching his figure shrink into the snowfall. The world beyond the glass was all blur, no lines, no certainty. Inside, warmth hummed, but it soothed nothing. Days slid by in dull routine. The widow came less often, pleading illness. Rumors stirred again, coarser than before. Some said the brewer's death had been divine punishment. Others whispered poison. The tavern keeper made no comment, only stirred her kettles and kept the accounts clear. Yet every breath of the malt air carried an echo of guilt, from whose throat she could no longer tell. Then one market morning, a boy arrived with a small package wrapped in brown cloth. He said it had been found among the brewer's possessions and sent, per instruction, to the tavern. Inside lay one sealed letter and a folded page of accounts, receipts matching those lost from her ledger. The letter began without greeting. "If truth should ever matter, these belong to the collector, not to you. I hid what I could, but others know more." Her hands went cold. Others, he had written, but who? The widow still lived, the warehouse men still worked. The warning carried both pity and accusation. It was not confession enough to clear her, but neither was it a complete lie. In the following weeks, her suspicion and pity began to blend, blurring their borders until even anger lost its edge. She remembered how the brewer had once spoken of honesty as bitterness, and now she felt it differently, that bitterness could purify, yes, but it could also consume. One fogged afternoon, she saw the widow again, walking slowly toward the church at the end of the street. The woman carried a basket of bread, her step uncertain. Moved by impulse, the tavern keeper followed at a distance. Inside the church, candles flickered along the aisle, their smoke coiling toward the vaulted ceiling. The widow knelt alone at the front, whispering a prayer too faint to hear. When she rose, she turned suddenly and saw her watcher. Their eyes met. The widow's lips trembled. "You think me wicked," she said quietly. "I think you frightened," came the answer, steady as spoken truth. The widow looked away. He was going to ruin us all. The taxman, then the brewer, always taking, always threatening. The accident, it was never meant, only to scare him. Her hands shook as she crossed herself. But he fell. We put him in the barrel because no one would believe it was chance. The tavern keeper stood still, words heavy in her throat. Then why remain silent? They would have hanged me, and you. By the time the body was found, guilt needed a face. Yours was nearest. A bitter smile twisted her mouth. Sometimes survival is just another name for sin. Without waiting for reply, the widow stepped past her and vanished into the fog. The church door swung shut, leaving only the creak of old hinges. Back at the tavern, she lit every lamp, though daylight still clung to the window panes. Shadows retreated into corners. For the first time in months, the room seemed lighter, freer, as if the walls had finally exhaled. That evening, she wrote a letter to the constable. No accusations, no names. Only an account of what she had heard, phrased as memory rather than accusation. Truth, once spoken, was its own burden. Best to let it fall gently. When morning came, frost glittered on the eaves. She opened the shutters, letting cold air pour through the room. The smell of malt drifted up from the cellar, faint, patient, older than guilt. Down there, the barrels waited again, filled with fresh brew, harmless now, unremarkable. She ran her palm along one, feeling its smooth grain, the quiet promise of work yet to be done. Outside, church bells began to ring, slow and steady, counting hours that no longer held accusation. The city stirred. The market wheels creaked back into motion. She straightened her apron and checked the tables. There was no comfort in what she had learned, but there was clarity, and that, perhaps, was enough. Truth had taken everything it could. What remained belonged to living, and living, for her, had always begun with opening the door, lighting the fire, and serving what warmth she could to those who asked for it. Spring thaw crept into the city without flourish, the kind that revealed more mud than flowers. Streets gleamed with meltwater, and carts splashed along the cobbles as though the earth itself sighed from exhaustion. In the tavern near the marketplace, the air smelled of damp wood and renewal, the kind of renewal that carries the memory of decay. By then, the constable had come less often. When he did, his uniform looked worn, his tone polite but hollow, like a man who had learned that doing right seldom pays the rent. He read her letter 3 times, saying nothing, then folded it neatly into his coat. She watched his fingers, pale and calloused, move with deliberate calm. No promise followed, no words of protection or relief. Only a quiet understanding passed between them, the kind that needs no witness. After his visit, silence returned, but it was softer now. The tavern filled again with customers, hesitant at first, then steady. Workers came for stew before dawn, merchants for ale past dusk. Children ran errands across the threshold, and laughter dared to resurface between toasts. People had begun to speak of the tragedy as something finished, something that had, at last, found its rightful corner in conversation. Still, she carried a heaviness of knowing. Truth, she discovered, did not cleanse, it only settled inside, quieter, perhaps, but ever present. When the widow failed to appear for several days, a whisper moved through the market that the woman had taken ill. Later came confirmation from a messenger. A fever worsening, unattended by friends. She was being kept at home under church care. The tavern keeper walked there one cloudy afternoon with a basket of bread and broth. The house smelled of tallow, its shutters drawn. The widow received her politely, though her face had paled to something almost translucent. She sat by the window, too weak to move much, yet her eyes remained vivid. "Did he suffer?" the tavern keeper asked softly, without naming who she meant. "Not long," came the answer. "Fate took the trouble from us. I think now it meant mercy." The widow coughed, her voice thinning. "When we hit him, I thought the world would swallow me. But hiding doesn't end the thing. It only teaches you how to wake beside it every morning." She placed the basket on the sill and turned to leave, but the older woman's next words stopped her. "There's a book inside the cupboard by the stove. Give it to the constable when I no longer breathe." The tavern keeper nodded and departed without farewell. Days later, when bells tolled for the widow's passing, she returned to that dim house. Dust drifted in the light like falling flour. The little cupboard still smelled faintly of lard and candles. Inside lay a small ledger wrapped in cloth, the kind merchants used for private dealings. Its pages held detailed accounts shared between initials, listing payments from the brewer, the tax collector's collections, and contributions noted from others. Even a letter from an alderman was tucked between pages, vague enough to suggest patronage without guilt. She carried the ledger to the constable's station at dusk. The man received it without surprise. Perhaps he had expected it. Perhaps he too had grown tired of pretense. "This will be enough," he said quietly. And then, after a pause, "You've done your part." When she left the building, evening shadows stretched across the square. For the first time since the day she'd found the body, she felt a sort of stillness settle inside. Not triumph, not even relief, but the end of a long breath held too long. News spread quickly. The inquest resumed only briefly. The widow's dealings, the brewer's evasion, the tax collector's abuses all gave the authorities a convenient shape for justice. The townsfolk discussed it over meals, each retelling, dulling the edges of what had been cruel. Justice, in their mouths, sounded tidy enough to believe in. Her tavern, once avoided, became fashionable again. The constable's name, spoken in neutral tones, appeared in papers for his careful investigation. She read none of it. Words on a page could not mend the quiet she'd kept, nor the scars it left. She tended her fire, skimmed the foam from boiling pots, kept her books in order, and told herself that calm was its own form of forgiveness. Sometimes, on cold mornings, she walked to the river where the mills puffed out smoke. She liked the smell, sharp yet honest, and the rhythm of the water against stone. It reminded her of her father's workshop, repetitive labor, steady purpose. Life, she thought, is no more than learning which weight one can bear and which must be set down before dusk. Under the growing sun, Munich began to change. The new factories along the Isar belched progress into the air, and with it came noise and confusion. Fresh faces appeared in the market. Soldiers, clerks, students who spoke of industry and politics. Some nights her tavern filled with their debates. She listened while drying mugs, catching phrases about a new world, freedom, machines. It all seemed distant to her, a language spoken by those who still believed they could choose their own time. The constable visited once more before being transferred north. He arrived near closing, without uniform, wearing a coat shiny at the elbows. "The case is shut," he told her simply, "officially enough to please those above me." Unofficially, he stopped, smiled faintly. "Well, not everything written becomes true." They drank in silence a while. He asked if she planned to stay. "For now," she said, "the fire still burns where it should." When he rose to leave, he looked at her as if memorizing something plain yet steadfast, the quiet face of endurance. "We do what we can," he murmured. "The rest stays with God or the wind." After he left, the tavern seemed larger than usual. The sound of the door closing echoed longer than it should have. She stood behind the counter, tracing circles on the worn wood with a damp cloth, before finally putting out the lamps. Time settled into its slow, forgiving pattern. The markets resumed their chatter, barrels rolled through the yard, and the city's rhythm reclaimed what tragedy had once shaken loose. Yet she, alone among her routines, carried the ghost of the tax collector's barrel not as horror, but as memory. Part of the fabric of her life, spilled and cleaned, impossible to erase. On some evenings, when trade was slow and the fire steady, she would take her meal near the window overlooking the square. Outside, snowmelt ran along the gutters, catching shards of light from nearby lanterns. She would eat in silence, hearing laughter rise from other taverns, and think how every piece is bargained from some earlier sorrow. Once a young man at the counter asked her whether she believed in justice. He was new to the city, his coat too fine for his manner. She refilled his mug before answering. "Justice," she said, "is a coin with many hands upon it. Sometimes you touch it only when it's already cold." He nodded politely, not understanding, and left a generous tip. After he was gone, she smiled faintly, not for amusement, but for recognition of her own words, how calm they sounded coming from someone who had lived them. Outside, night pressed against the windows, carrying snow again, soft and soundless. She tended to the fire once more, steady as she had always been. The room was warm, the air scented faintly with malt, and for the first time in years, the scrape of her broom across the floor made no echo of fear. Only the ordinary sound of work continuing after all has been reckoned and forgiven. The years rolled on quietly, carried by the steady rhythm of everyday things. The tavern beside the marketplace belonged to someone else now, a younger couple with quick smiles and new curtains in the windows. Where she once stood behind the counter, they now placed bunches of wildflowers, changed weekly, as if scent alone could ward off old ghosts. She bore them no resentment. Time, like trade, prefers new hands. She lived upriver, in a smaller town where mills turned without pause, and smoke rose from factory chimneys in measured columns. Her home stood near the bridge, rooms small but bright. Each morning, she woke to the sound of clanging metal and church bells answering each other across the valley. The air still smelled faintly of malt when the wind shifted from the south, carrying memories of beer and laughter she no longer served, but somehow still knew by heart. In this quieter place, she was known simply as the aunt who baked the best rye bread, who tended herbs on her windowsill, who laughed softly when the children from the street brought her wild flowers they had no need to pick. Her hands remained strong, her gestures precise. Age softened her face, but those who sat a while in her kitchen sometimes noticed the stillness in her eyes. The kind that comes only to people who have seen themselves outlive everything that once frightened them. Even now, she kept ledgers, not for business, but for memory. Small notebooks filled with half-remembered recipes, the price of flour in good years, and the sayings of customers she once overheard and could not forget. Sometimes she wrote about the years after the barrel, though always in a way detached from herself, as though the woman at the center of it all were a neighbor long since gone. The town itself hummed with the noise of progress. Steam engines whistled near the railway depot, and the river carried barges loaded with sacks of grain and coal. The old rhythms of cobblers and coopers, once the pulse of her youth, had given way to machines, spitting out the work of a dozen men. She did not dislike it. She only found it curious how quickly the world could change its tools while keeping the same measures of greed and kindness. Sometimes, when she walked along the riverbank, she thought of the constable. She imagined him settled somewhere north, his hair silver, still walking with the same hesitant step. Their last conversation had never left her. He had spoken of doing what one can, leaving the rest to the wind. She had thought it a simple comfort then. Now she heard in it the real wisdom of mortality. The wind, after all, carries everything sooner or later: truth, rumor, guilt, even friendship. On quiet evenings, she received visits from her niece, a tall girl with ringlets and quick speech, whose chatter filled the rooms with a second youth. The girl listened raptly when her aunt told stories of Munich, not of scandal or inquiry, but of festivals, bakeries, and the first railway that made the ground tremble like a giant's laugh. When the niece asked about the tavern, the old woman smiled, poured her tea, and said only that it had been a place where good folk learned the price of listening and the value of silence. No bitterness lived in her recollection. Even the memory of the widow brought not anger, but a gentle pity. They had all been children to their own fears. That thought came often to her lately, the odd tenderness of human weakness. She found herself forgiving people she had once barely endured, and missing those she had hardly known. The world, it seemed, always balanced itself through the small mercies of memory. Her daily routine was as simple as breath. Mornings for work, baking, sweeping, writing. Afternoons for errands in town. She liked visiting the marketplace to hear the traders quarrel over apples or measure out sugar by the handful. The sounds reminded her of the city that never quite left her, and of how every bargain is really a form of hope, each coin traded for the promise that tomorrow will taste the same. In early summer, she began keeping a small garden. Each plant felt like an act of quiet rebellion against the years that had once demanded everything of her but time. When she kneaded dough, she often caught herself humming again, snatches of the hymns her mother used to hum long ago, back when life was still half guesswork and half grace. In those moments, childhood felt not behind her, but folded neatly inside her days, soft as the flower on her palms. One evening, rain rolled across the valley just as the lamps were being lit along the bridge. She sat by the window, watching light tremble on puddles. Smoke from nearby chimneys mixed with mist rising from the river, blending into a single pale ribbon that drifted upward toward nowhere in particular. There was comfort in its shapelessness. It reminded her of the steam that had once filled her tavern, the warmth of bodies, the scent of ale, the low hum of laughter. Life, she thought, had always been that way, transient, fragrant, impossible to hold without burning one's fingers. As night settled, she trimmed her lamp and took up a worn pencil. On the blank page, she wrote not names or events, but a single line. Everything that is kept will one day vanish. Everything given freely remains. Then she paused, set the pencil down, and read the sentence aloud, letting it belong to the room more than to herself. Outside, the church bell tolled. A train groaned somewhere beyond the hills, its smoke folding into the mist. She breathed deeply, letting those sounds, bell, river, machine, meld into a strange kind of lullaby. The rhythm of the world had changed, yes, but its heart was the same beat she had always known. Work, rest, endurance, and the faint laughter of chance. Before sleep, she poured hot water into a mug and watched the steam curl upward in lazy spirals. The sight pleased her. It was honest, humble, and alive only for a moment before fading. Tomorrow she would wake early again, knead the dough, sweep the threshold, and sit by the window to watch the morning wagons roll past. And perhaps, when the first light reached her kitchen wall, the same thin line of gold she remembered from her tavern stove, she would smile at how everything, even grief, eventually turns into something gentle once enough seasons have passed. The kettle whistled softly, a sound like breath returning. She moved to pour the water over the tea leaves. Outside, the night glowed faintly from the lamps of the bridge, their reflections swaying on the river like patient stars. It was late, but not lonely. The house was warm, and the air smelled of rain, bread, and memory. All the ingredients, she thought, of a life that had learned how to last.